Welcome, everyone, and hold on tight, because what you're about to hear might just stop you in your tracks. Bursting at the seams with immigrants chasing the American dream. Factories belch smoke into the autumn sky. Horse-drawn trolleys clatter down cobblestone streets lined with tenements. And right there, in the heart of it all, on an ordinary weekday morning outside a plain two-story brick building at 144 Floyd Street, a line of desperate, hopeful people stretches for blocks. Housewives clutching worn purses, factory workers in threadbare coats, elderly immigrants who crossed the ocean with nothing but faith, every single one of them pressing crumpled dollar bills into the hands of clerks inside. They're handing over their life savings to a soft-spoken 25-year-old church kid named William Franklin Miller. He promises to turn every $10 into $52 in just 1 year, guaranteed. 10% profit every single week, no risk. Inside stock tips from Wall Street insiders. Before the words Ponzi scheme ever existed, this ordinary-looking Sunday school teacher had already perfected the blueprint and stole more than $1 million from thousands of everyday Americans. Hello, friends, and a massive, heartfelt welcome to every single one of you tuning in today. Whether you're watching from the bustling streets of New York City, the windy plains of Chicago, the sunny beaches of California, the heart of Texas, the swamps of Florida, or anywhere across this vast and beautiful nation of ours. If you love gripping true American history, financial scandals that feel ripped from today's headlines, underdog stories gone wrong, or just jaw-dropping tales of ambition, greed, and the eternal chase for the American dream, you have found your new favorite channel. This is the complete, expanded, astonishingly detailed, fact-packed epic of William 520% Miller and the Franklin Syndicate. A real-life saga so wild, so vividly documented in 1899 newspapers, court records, eyewitness accounts, and bankruptcy filings that it reads like the best Hollywood script, except every single detail is true. I've written this narration especially for you, rich with scene-setting descriptions, real quotes from the era, blow-by-blow timelines, and vivid character portraits, so your voiceover can sync perfectly with archival black-and-white photos, grainy newspaper clippings, dramatic reenactments of crowded streets, cash-stuffed offices, panicked crowds, and courtroom drama. Grab a coffee, settle in, and let's travel back 125 years to one of the most shocking financial crimes in U.S. history, before anyone knew what a Ponzi was. To truly understand how William Miller pulled this off, we have to set the stage in the Gilded Age, that glittering, unequal, explosive period between the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century, when America transformed from a farming nation into an industrial powerhouse. Picture it, skyscrapers clawing into the Manhattan sky, the Brooklyn Bridge a marvel of engineering only 16 years old, railroads stretching coast to coast like iron veins pumping wealth. Titans like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and Cornelius Vanderbilt built fortunes that made European royalty jealous. But for the millions of ordinary folks, Irish, Italian, German, Jewish, and Eastern European immigrants pouring through Ellis Island, life was a daily grind. The Panic of 1893 was still a raw wound. Banks collapsed overnight. Unemployment hit 20% in some cities. Factories laid off workers without warning. A skilled factory hand might earn $12 to $15 a week. A savings account in a legitimate bank paid a measly 3 to 6% interest per year, if you were lucky enough to have savings at all. The stock market? That was a rich man's casino uptown on Wall Street, where bucket shops, shady storefront gambling parlors pretending to be brokerages, fleeced the working class daily. Families dreamed of a little house, a plot of land, or just enough to send the kids to school without hunger. Enter William Franklin Miller. Born around 1874 in Brooklyn to modest parents, he was no silver spoon kid. By his early 20s, he was married with a young child suffering from a chronic illness that demanded expensive medicine. He'd tried the honest path, Office boy, clerk, bookkeeper, but the long hours and tiny paychecks left him bitter. He attended Bible study faithfully at the Tompkins Avenue Congregational Church. He carried a worn Bible in his pocket and spoke softly with a quiet charm that made people trust him instantly. He wasn't a flamboyant crook like the robber barons. He was the guy next door, but ambition burned inside him. He started dabbling in those same bucket shops, betting on stocks he didn't own. He lost what little he had and fell into debt. One humiliating night, staring at his sick baby and mounting bills, the idea struck like divine inspiration, or so he later claimed. On March 16, 1899, not 1898 as some early rumors had it, Miller stood up after a prayer meeting in the church hall. A small group of fellow worshipers listened as he explained his system. "Friends, I have access to inside information from Wall Street. Give me $10, I'll invest it wisely, and every week I'll pay you back $1, 10% on your money, and I guarantee your principal is safe, no loss possible." The first brave soul was 20-year-old Oscar Bergstrom, a young clerk. He handed over exactly $10 and received a handwritten receipt, the principal guaranteed against loss. 3 more friends followed that same week. Miller paid their first dividends out of his own pocket and the tiny bit left from his failed trading. Word spread like wildfire through the church pews, then the neighborhood tenements, then across Brooklyn. Why break your back for pennies when your money could make miracles? By April, the operation had outgrown his tiny apartment. He rented the entire second floor of 144 Floyd Street, a working-class tenement building in a densely packed immigrant neighborhood. He hired a handful of clerks, young men from the same church circles. He printed elegant circulars quoting Benjamin Franklin, "The way to wealth is as plain as the road to market." The Franklin Syndicate was born. Those circulars were masterpieces of persuasion. Mailed nationwide, they read, "Your $10 or more is invested each week in stocks or wheat futures using inside information. We guarantee you no loss. Withdraw anytime. 10% every week, paid like clockwork." He ran paid advertisements in more than 800 newspapers from Boston to Chicago to San Francisco. He spent over $32,000 on advertising alone, an enormous sum in $1899. A slick promoter named Cecil Leslie joined as publicist, spreading rumors that Miller had senators and railroad magnates feeding him tips. None of it was true, but the public didn't care. Let's paint the scene inside the Franklin Syndicate office in its glory days of summer 1899. Every weekday morning, the wooden stoop outside 144 Floyd Street creaks under the weight of hundreds waiting in line. Housewives in shawls and bonnets, factorymen in flat caps and soot-stained shirts, old German immigrants with thick accents, young Italian couples dreaming of a farm in New Jersey. They shuffle forward slowly. Inside, long wooden tables groan under stacks of cash and checks. Clerks in shirt sleeves count bills with practiced speed, issue receipts stamped Franklin Syndicate, principal guaranteed, and hand out crisp $1 dividend envelopes. Upstairs, in a makeshift private office, William Miller sits at a plain desk wearing a cheap but freshly pressed suit. His boyish face and calm demeanor make him look like the honest neighborhood bookkeeper he once was. He signs receipts personally when important depositors arrive. By August, the daily intake averages $80,000, sometimes more. Mail bags arrive by the wagon load with envelopes from as far as California. At peak, the office floor is literally knee-deep in unopened mail. Clerks work late into the night sorting it.
Miller paid those 10% dividends religiously, at first with his own small capital, then with fresh deposits from new investors. Classic Ponzi mechanics, though the term wouldn't exist for another 21 years. Early investors got rich on paper. $10 became $52 in a year if left to compound. $100 became $520. A bricklayer earning $15 weekly could theoretically retire in months. Many reinvested their dividends, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Miller even encouraged it with bonuses. He tried actual trading once or twice. One surviving ledger shows he turned $1,000 of depositor money into $994.64, but mostly he simply paid old investors with new money and skimmed the rest for himself and his growing staff. The crowds grew so enormous that on one memorable day in October, the wooden stoop in front of 144 Floyd Street literally collapsed under the excited weight of investors. No one was seriously injured, but photographers captured the chaos. Newspapers across the country ran the picture with headlines like 520% Miller's Empire of Hope or The Boy Napoleon of Finance Conquers Brooklyn. Miller was 25 years old and suddenly famous. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Miller brought in partners. First, a mysterious figure named Edward Schlesinger, possibly another small-time operator, who took a one-third cut of profits and oversaw nightly cash counts with military precision. Then, in September 1899, a newspaper advertising buyer named Rudy Gunther introduced Miller to the flamboyant Colonel Robert A. Ammon. Ammon was a larger-than-life lawyer, union defender, and courtroom showman who had represented everyone from crooked politicians to striking workers. He saw pure gold in Miller's operation. Together, they hatched a plan to incorporate the syndicate and convert small deposits into high-priced shares, supposedly worth $400 to $500 each. This would lock in the money and slow payouts. Investors with less than $50 were pressured to add more cash or risk losing everything. Many did. The first serious red flag came from a small financial newsletter called On Change, edited by E.L. Blake at 20 Broad Street in Manhattan. Blake began publishing pointed questions. Where exactly is the money invested? How can any legitimate business pay 520% annually? Miller, stung, implied to depositors that Blake was a blackmailer trying to shake him down. Word got back. Blake filed a $50,000 libel lawsuit. On November 21, 1899, Deputy Sheriff O'Donnell arrested Miller on the civil warrant. Miller posted $5,000 bail, but the damage was done. The next day, the Kings County District Attorney indicted him for grand larceny and conspiracy. Panic erupted. Picture the scene on November 22nd. Hundreds of frantic investors shoving and shouting outside 144 Floyd Street, waving receipts, demanding their money back. Miller and Ammon tried to calm the mob with telegrams promising a massive secret stock deal worth millions. Fresh cash actually poured in, $81,000 in a single day, as some desperate souls doubled down. But checks started bouncing. On November 23rd, Miller quietly transferred roughly $250,000 in cash, bonds, and securities to Ammon for safekeeping. The next morning, he slipped out of Brooklyn with a suitcase of money, heading for Canada. He left his wife and young child behind. The Franklin Syndicate collapsed overnight. Police raided 144 Floyd Street and found almost nothing, a few $1,000s in loose cash, and deliberately destroyed ledgers. Later accounting estimated the syndicate had taken in more than $1,156,000, perhaps as much as $1.2 million, from roughly 12,000 to 13,000 victims. That's the equivalent of $40 million in today's dollars. Only about $13,000 was ever recovered from the office itself. Miller made it to Montreal but was arrested on February 2, 1900, by a sharp Canadian detective named Captain James Reynolds after a tip from U.S. authorities. Extradited back to New York in chains, he faced trial in April 1900.
The courtroom was a circus. Witnesses described the endless lines, the prompt dividends, the impossible promises. Miller's defense was heartbreakingly simple. "I never intended to steal. I believed in my system. The newspapers ruined everything. I would have paid everyone back if they had just given me time." The jury convicted him on April 30th of grand larceny. Judge sentenced him to 10 years in Sing Sing prison. Prison life nearly killed him. Locked in solitary for his own protection, Miller contracted tuberculosis. He appealed relentlessly. One appeal briefly overturned the conviction, only for it to be reinstated. In 1903, he testified against his former partner, Colonel Robert Ammon, who was tried separately for receiving stolen goods. Ammon received 4 years. Schlesinger had already fled to Europe and disappeared. By 1905 or early 1906, Miller was released early on humanitarian grounds, his health shattered but his spirit somehow unbroken. He tried to vanish completely. Moving to Long Island, he adopted the alias William Schmidt and opened a small grocery store in Rockville Center. He remarried, had more children, paid his bills on time, and lived quietly for nearly a decade. Neighbors knew him as a friendly shopkeeper who never talked about stocks. Then, in November 1914, a family quarrel with his brother-in-law blew his cover wide open. During a police court hearing over an assault charge, the brother-in-law shouted, "He's not Schmidt, he's 520% Miller, the swindler." Miller broke down under cross-examination, but admitted everything. Nobody would have trusted Miller, but as Schmidt, I got along fairly well. He owned property, ran an honest business, and never attempted another scheme. The New York Times headline screamed, "520% Miller exposed in court." He faded from public view after that, and died sometime around 1940, exact date lost to history, from complications of the tuberculosis he caught in prison. Now, let's talk about the human cost, because this wasn't just numbers on a ledger. Thousands of ordinary Americans were ruined. An elderly widow in Boston who invested her entire $800 life savings never recovered a penny. She ended her days in a charity home. A young Irish immigrant couple in Brooklyn who had scrimped for 2 years to buy a small farm lost every cent and returned to tenement life with 3 children. Factory workers who had reinvested their dividends saw their paper wealth evaporate overnight. Court records from the bankruptcy proceedings show victims recovering mere pennies on the dollar after years of legal wrangling. Many never forgave themselves. Churches held special sermons warning against Miller's temptation. Sunday schools used the story as a cautionary tale. If it sounds too good to be true, it is. And here's the astonishing historical footnote of all. Across the Atlantic, in Italy, a bright but restless teenager named Carlo Ponzi read newspaper accounts of Miller's spectacular rise and fall. The details stuck with him. 21 years later, in 1920, Ponzi launched his own scheme in Boston, promising 50% profit in 45 days on international reply coupons. He took in millions, became a celebrity, and gave the scam its permanent name. William Miller, the forgotten Brooklyn bookkeeper, had written the original playbook.
So what timeless lessons does this 125-year-old American tragedy teach us in 2026? Greed and hope remain the most powerful drugs known to humanity. Charisma and impossible promises can blind even the savviest among us. Regulators in 1899 were slow and under-resourced, just as they sometimes seem today when new technologies promise overnight riches. The desire for a better life, for security, for a piece of the American dream never fades. Yet history shows that shortcuts built on lies always collapse, crushing the very people they claim to help. Friends, thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching this deep, exhaustive dive into one of the most surprising and instructive chapters in American financial history. I spent weeks poring over every surviving newspaper clipping, court transcript and contemporary account to make this narration as rich, vivid, and accurate as possible, so you could feel like you were standing right there on Floyd Street in 1899, hearing the shuffle of feet and the clink of coins. Now I want to hear directly from you, the best audience on the internet. What kind of story would you like next? Another forgotten financial scandal from the Gilded Age or Roaring Twenties? A true crime saga from the Wild West? The dramatic rise and fall of a robber baron? Maybe something completely different. Epic survival tales from American history? Unsolved mysteries that still haunt us? Space race heroes and villains? Or even modern-day stories of resilience and redemption? Drop your ideas in the comments below. I read every single one, and the most requested or creative suggestions become our next full-length video. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical of any promise that sounds too good to be true, protect your hard-earned money, and take care of yourselves and your families. God bless America, and thank you again for being part of this growing community of history lovers. This is your host, signing off with the very best wishes for your health, your happiness, and a little extra dose of that old-fashioned American grit and wisdom. See you in the next incredible story.